And we're happy to welcome back former New York Congressman Bill Owens, who now works as a senior advisor at Denton's, a global law firm based in Washington. You are a consultant on U.S.-Canada relations and border trade. Also, since leaving Congress, you're doing commentaries for public radio, and also you're a contributor to the Hill newspaper that covers Capitol Hill in Washington. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Trade disputes over softwood lumber and dairy aren't new. There have been issues between the U.S. and Canada for decades. So why is the U.S. picking a fight with Canada now?
Well, I think this arises out of Mr. Trump's election. He promised to make changes to NAFTA, either renegotiate it or tear it up. And so he's focusing on issues that come up in the news or come up in that relationship and is trying to use those as levers, I think.
This is the first shot in what's looking more and more certain to be a battle over NAFTA.
I clearly believe so. About 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months, the trade representatives sent a letter to Congress laying out their issues that they might raise in a renegotiation. And that was kind of a draft letter. They've got to give 90 days advance notice to Congress before they proceed with a renegotiation. And this letter was that draft, and then ultimately they'll get to a final letter.
Last week he went back and forth on this. He said the U.S. was pulling out, then backed off after talking to the president of Mexico and Prime Minister Trudeau, and said that renegotiation would be the route that the U.S. would probably go.
Right, and if you look back from really just the day of the inauguration forward, he's probably moved on this issue 3 or 4 or 5 times in completely different directions. So it's very hard to know where he's going or what's he thinking about.
We'll get to NAFTA and some of the issues in just a moment, but back to the softwood lumber and dairy. For the softwood lumber, the argument from the U.S. is that the Canadian provincial government subsidizes the timber companies?
That's right. They give them a subsidy which allows them to produce the timber at a cheaper rate and therefore export it cheaper.
Is this a big deal for Canada? Do they export a lot of lumber to the U.S.?
Absolutely. But it's also going to have an impact in the U.S. because, as many commentators pointed out, this will cause new home costs to increase. Because effectively what you're doing is you're tacking a tariff onto the goods that are imported. Who's going to pay it? The consumer.
This goes back decades. The dairy dispute, on the other hand, has just really been within the past year, hasn't it? That Canada has changed its pricing structure for milk and milk products. No mistake, the move was to help farmers in Quebec and Ontario.
So you have two games at play there. You have the ultra-filtered milk issue, which is really hitting Wisconsin in particularly hard. It also hits some farmers in Western New York. Then you have the overall dairy subsidy program in Canada, which is focused on Quebec and Eastern Ontario. So you kind of have 2 different things at play. The subsidy issue was specifically left out of NAFTA in '94 to allow the Canadians to maintain that. Of course, then we passed in 14 the ag bill, the 5-year ag bill that contained a new insurance program that the Canadians claim is really a subsidy.
So U.S. farmers are now being underbid. They were selling the ultra-filtered milk to cheese and yogurt makers in Canada.
Well, they're being charged a tax, a provincial level tax when the milk enters Canada. So that increases, obviously, the cost to the Canadian purchaser, and therefore they can buy it locally more cheaply.
So if this doesn't fall under NAFTA or a trade agreement, on what grounds does the president and the New York congressional delegation have to say this isn't fair?
Well, I think the only thing that they really have is they've got the lumber dispute. And they could marry those 2 up and say, look, if you're going to take this position on ultra-filtered milk, we're going to continue to stand by tariffs on the lumber. Hopefully what they'll do eventually is get to a point where they marry them up and then reach a compromise on both.
After announcing he planned to pull the U.S. out of NAFTA last week and then later backing down, President Trump appears to now say that NAFTA needs to be renegotiated. So what will be the key issues, do you think?
I think what you're going to see is things that focus around ag. I think that's going to be a big player. I think intellectual property will be a big player. Now, these are not things that are sort of hitting the mainstream media, but if you look at where the issues are that really affect people, or at least affect business, it's those areas that I think that they'll focus on. Now, there's been some conversation about supply chain issues, but that's really complicated. You know, when you have somebody in Plattsburgh or somebody in Detroit who's moving product back and forth across the border, that becomes very difficult to manage and not interrupt the flow of business. So I think that they'll talk about that, but whether or not they actually renegotiate it, I think is a different question.
Like auto parts.
Like auto parts, exactly.
And if the U.S. slaps a tariff on auto parts going back and forth, that throws a wrench into the works.
It does, and it will likely result in the Canadians doing the same thing, which only has one impact, and that's to raise the cost of cars on both sides of the border.
Are there some issues under NAFTA that should be changed and updated?
Well, I think it has to be updated and brought into the 21st century, particularly as it relates to the internet. You have a lot of trade that's now internet-based, and that has a different set of issues associated with it. Years ago, you didn't have people going online and buying something on eBay from somebody in Toronto or somebody in Georgia. And how you get those goods back and forth across the border, what kind of documentation you need to provide, those things need to be resolved.
What about here in the North Country, farmers and businesses and others in the North Country? How could it impact the business here?
Well, I have a slightly different take on that. I'm not as much concerned about how they renegotiate NAFTA as I am how Buy America gets implemented. That is a major issue, and Mr. Trump has talked about, build it in America, hire Americans, those kinds of conversations, and that really could have more impact on us locally than changes to NAFTA. People will adjust to NAFTA changes, just like they did to CAFTA before, but much more difficult to deal with is the Made in America provisions. And if you've talked to the people at Bombardier or Nova Bus, they're very concerned about that being ratcheted up to the point that it essentially makes everything needing to be made in America.
It's already an issue in Albany this legislative
That's right.
session.
And they fortunately got that dropped out of the final budget bill, but you have the New York City Transit Authority has very strong Made in America provisions. In fact, they have Made in New York provisions, which impacts where people locate plants. And that's the kind of thing that has a real direct effect in our region versus where I think NAFTA is going.
So that's more of a concern. I was going to ask, under NAFTA, are the Canadian companies here that employ thousands worried about a renegotiation of NAFTA? But it sounds like there may be other trade issues that they would be more worried about.
I'm sure they're concerned about it, but I'm not sure that that's their primary area of concern at this point.
The loonie is struggling against the dollar.
Yesterday it hit 73 cents, which was a pretty significant low, impacted by a couple of things. One, the conversations about tearing up NAFTA or renegotiating NAFTA. The other, of course, is the falling oil prices. So I think we have to be, or I think our government should be more sensitive to that process, because I don't think that they understand the negative impact it has on the U.S. economy and on the Canadian economy. And I think that's just one of those areas that I'm not sure the current administration focuses on. In truth, I don't think the Obama administration or the Bush administration really had a handle on that issue either. It's just that Mr. Trump has excited everyone with his tweets and comments about NAFTA.
Big changes are coming in Canada. A year from this summer, small amounts of marijuana will be legalized. Of course, we're seeing it around New England and Maine and Massachusetts and other states. Will this create issues at the border, do you think?
I think quite likely it will. Obviously, you're going to have people coming to the border. My suspicion is that there will be times when people will be impaired as a result of that. How they decide to handle that at the border will be interesting. For instance, will the officers be ordered to ask do you smoke marijuana, right? If they do, that's going to create some real issues for our Canadian visitors, because if they say no, then they could be accused of lying and therefore not allowed into the country. If they say yes, they may not be allowed into the country because we may take the position that that breaches U.S. law. If you look at it on I think a jurisdictional analysis, legal analysis, if you're doing something that's legal in the place where you reside, it should have no impact when you come to the border. Now, if you're in possession, that's a different question. If you're currently impaired, that's a different question. But I think the mere use in an environment where it's perfectly legal should be ignored.
Do you think increased scrutiny at the border could lead to backups and problems?
Clearly. I think it very well may. So a lot depends upon how DHS decides to handle this situation. And I'm hopeful that they'll take the position that I just laid out.